Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started with our webinar. You are joining the second of 3 webinars in a series exploring COVID-19 and the food system. My name's Bill McKelvey. I'm a senior project coordinator with the University of Missouri Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security. We're excited to have Dr. Shoshanah Inwood today from Ohio State University to talk to us about emergency management and work that's being done in Ohio to connect the food and ag sector with emergency management. And kudos to Shoshanah for a really excellent title. COVID-19 brought us together, building new collaborations between Ohio's food and agriculture sector and state emergency management. If you could go to the next slide, please. I want to introduce Mary Hendrickson, co-director of the Center for Food Security.
Hi, folks, and welcome. We're glad to see all of you. I'm co-director of the Interdisciplinary Center. And what our center does is really focus on research, teaching, and outreach at the intersection of food security and food systems. We're well known for our Missouri Hunger Atlas. We do some other extension programming and some other research. So we're really glad to have you here today.
And the other sponsor of this event is the Community and Economic Development Food Systems team, which is part of University of Missouri Extension. This is a group of extension specialists who work on a variety of community engagement in education projects and programs, really focused on building healthy, resilient, equitable food systems. Next slide. Briefly, the webinar format today, we'll hear from Shoshanah for about 30 minutes, and then we've reserved the rest of the time for Q&A. So by all means, you're welcome to speak your question when we get to that portion of the webinar. You can also use the chat feature. It's really totally up to you. Recordings of this webinar and other webinars are found on our website. So if you visit foodsecurity.missouri.edu, check out our webinar series tab. You can see all of the previous recordings that we've done. And then within a few days, I'll have this recording edited and posted on the website as well. And then next slide, Shoshanah. We encourage folks to join us on April 15th. So that'll be the third and final webinar of this series. We'll be talking about food supply chains with Michelle Miller from UW-Madison. This is also an exciting opportunity to mention that this particular webinar on April 15th will be co-hosted by the MU Deaton Institute Within Reach Zero Hunger Conference. So they have events that are going on from April 12th through the 15th. This is sort of a side event with their conference. And so by all means, join us on April 15th, but feel free to check out the conference that the Deaton Institute is hosting as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shoshanah.
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Mary and Bill for inviting me to be part of your seminar series. I'm really excited to share what we've been doing in Ohio and then to really have a conversation and hear what's been happening within Missouri, what your experiences are, and how we can maybe build some broader collaborations and work with each other. So I also wanted to just acknowledge that I am part of a larger team at Ohio State who's been working on this issue of food systems and emergency management. So just really wanted to very quickly recognize my colleagues, Zoe Plakis, Jill Clark, Aiden Irish, and Nicole Wright. As we well know, in this work, we're never alone, right? It always takes a community. And so I just really appreciate their work. And what's really fun about this group is I think I assume is with the group that's on today is that we're all from different disciplines. And so we all really approach this work from very different angles. And so as a rural sociologist, you'll kind of see the way that I've been approaching this work and also some of the collaborations I've been making with Mary. So today what I wanted to do is just really 3 points, just to briefly touch a little bit about food systems and emergencies pre-COVID, how COVID really created some shocks, not just to the food system, but also to the emergency management system and how it functioned and all of a sudden had to really confront food. And then talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing with Ohio Emergency Management to really prepare for the next disaster and disruption. Okay, so I'm a rural sociologist that works on food and agriculture issues. And actually, Mary and I started talking a couple of years ago, really also thinking about how does these issues that we work so much on, thinking about the future with a shrinking and aging farm population, concentration and consolidation, and bifurcation of farm size, in the face of, at the same time, some of the really exciting work that's happening and trends around small and medium farms, beginning and young farmers, local food systems, and wealth-based approaches to agriculture. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm a little bit neurotic, and I think a lot about disasters, and started thinking about a couple years ago, like, what happens, right, if there's a cyber attack, with extreme shocks to extreme weather events, with big disasters or shocks coming from agricultural policy, like trade wars, right? What is that going to play out and mean for the food system? And especially when we think about like things like cyber attacks, right? Like most of our distribution system is based on the web. There's logistics that are all really tied into the web. Right. And what would the response look like? Would it be a civilian response? Would it be a military response? What are the issues we need to think about? And as Mary and I have been working on this issue, well, all of a sudden we had a pandemic. COVID erupted, right? And I think what's kind of interesting also about this work is when I was bringing it up for the last few years, there was a lot of, well, we thought about this right after 9/11, and then all the conversations really went away. So I think that there's actually a really interesting moment now to think about what does this mean with food systems and disaster planning. And to touch really briefly, wanted to take us back to that year and a half ago, and where the food systems and emergency management conversation was happening, because there were some overlap, but they were really pretty siloed. So when we look at, FEMA and the federal government's conversations and documents around food in a disaster, it was really thinking about temporary, short-term, very highly localized disasters, needing to have 3 days of food on hand, making sure that it's canned, right? If you needed to have water on hand, maybe you would need to sanitize the water, but really thinking about these localized disasters in terms of earthquakes, hurricanes, storms, electricity going out. And the other way that we see a lot of the discussion happening within the federal government pre-COVID was really thinking about food safety in a disaster. So thinking about what happens if your refrigeration goes down, right? What happens before, during, and after a flood or an electrical event. And then also the other, how do you get access to food if you've suffered through a disaster? So how do you sign up for SNAP benefits if you've been affected by a disaster? And that was kind of pretty much the majority of ways that the conversations and outreach were going on around food and emergencies. But at the same time, our friends at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore were doing some really interesting work thinking about this issue from a city perspective about what would happen in a disaster, try to map this out, and what would the food supply look like, and what would state agencies look like, and where could there be failures in the supply chain. And they have a really nice article in the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems and Community Development outlining this, and they also have a report. And one of the things that they really came out with was just how complicated it is to work through all these different layers of agencies, and that's just only thinking about it at a city level, right? But we really all had to confront this issue much larger, in a much larger way when COVID shook us. So I want to walk us through a little bit about what happened and how COVID shocked the food and emergency management system. And this is going to be kind of a personal story to tell you what happened here in Ohio. Beginning at the well, towards the end of March, beginning of April, those of us who study food and agriculture and started talking among our national networks, really trying to say like, hey, what are you seeing? Oh, Cargill and some of the large meat processors are starting to shut down their facilities. What's happening with the workers? How is this going to affect supply chains? And as we started to see, what does a global pandemic mean when we knew we had a global and national food supply system, right? What is that going to look like? So whether I regret it or not now, I started emailing colleagues within OSU listing out, these are some of the anticipated shocks and issues that we could really see emerging. What's the response going to be? How are we prepared to do this as a land grant and to address some of these issues? What was interesting was our dean, Dean Crest, convened a task force, and I co-chaired this task force with Zoe Plakis. It was called the COVID-19 Food Supply Task Force. And in that process, what was really interesting is we got a call from Ohio Emergency Management. And they said, we don't really understand the food system, but we really need some help. And so we spent some time really trying to explain what is a food system, how does it work? And what I wanted to do in this section was to explain a little bit about how emergency management works and with the groups that we're working with. And then also talk us through some of the events that we saw in COVID from an emergency management perspective, right? Which is going to be very different from like if you were part of a local food policy council or depending if you were in a different state agency. So our primary contacts within Ohio Emergency Management have been ESF 6 and ESF 11. What's interesting is that when you look at the plan, and I know some of you do work in disasters, there's 15 different emergency support functions and groups within Ohio. And we were primarily working with ESF 6, which is really about mass care. And they really focus on sheltering, feeding, counseling, providing first aid, and all kinds of social services related to disaster survivors. And they're coordinated through the State Emergency Operations Center. We've also been working a lot with ESF 11. Now they are tasked with doing food and agriculture work. And what's interesting is that they are supposed to be led by the Ohio Department of Agriculture through any type of disaster or disruption. And their focus is really on the provision of ag-related services, the testing of products, identifying food supply needs, and a big focus on any kind of animal disease. There's any kind of need for veterinary supplies. They have a dangerous wild animal plan and animal disease incident plan. What is interesting is we also have ESF 8, which is the Public Health and Medical Services. We have not really been working with them, but what we found is through this process, if you look at any of the 15 ESFs, none of them really deal with food, right? And what are you going to do in a disaster? Because again, most of the framework has been around a 3-day disaster and being able to pull in food from another county, another region of the state, or another state till things get back up to normal. But in this global pandemic, folks were really at a loss. And what was also really interesting is in Ohio, our lead agency being the Ohio Department of Ag for ESF 11, the Department of Ag in Ohio is very regulatory. So their primary focus really became on issues associated with depopulation of livestock, particularly as the processing sectors became really overwhelmed. And there was really nobody who was able to coordinate or understand all these different food supply issues. So what I wanted to do now is just kind of walk us through what some of the different issues are, right? And how they were playing out at the state level, but also the local level. Ohio has 88 counties, right? And while each county is supposed to have a disaster plan, they don't include food, right? And it's also becoming clear that even if you have a plan, they don't necessarily have to be enforced, and Ohio EMA has no regulatory teeth to really check in on these. So this is also, I think, can be something really important for us to come back to at the end of our discussion when we're thinking about moving forward. Okay, so I'm not going to rehash all of the things that happened, but everybody remembers, right, the beginning of the we saw certain supply chains were really affected more than others, right? Going to the grocery store and not having meat, right? Or having really expensive meat or different cuts of meat, right? Looking at dairy, different supply chains really seem to be affected differently. And this was something that Ohio EMA had to really start to understand what is happening here. Because at the same time also, right, people were losing their jobs, they're staying at home, and all of a sudden mass care had to start really working very closely with the food banks about how do we distribute food, right? Where do we distribute food? What kind of food? And in the midst of this, USDA has the food box program. And that actually was extremely frustrating. And that was actually the impetus for why Ohio EMA contacted us at OSU, because they were seeing all kinds of problems with this food box program. One of the other issues that was happening is, from EMA's perspective, is that they really rely on a lot of partnerships with the food banks, with different civil society organizations to distribute this care. A lot of those organizations rely on volunteers, right, who tend to be older. So we can see in this population, you know, there's somebody who's a little bit older who's giving food to somebody who's much older in Meals on Wheels. And there was this huge issue of our volunteer base is gone, right? How do we then adjust and adapt to that? What we started to see in the state was there's also a shift because of COVID restrictions of the types of food that were being prepared. So it used to be that Meals on Wheels was delivering a lot of actually scratch made or locally made foods, and they were shifting into purchasing ready-made, much more processed foods from Texas and having those shipped in and then delivered. So there's also some interesting issues that happen there with in terms of nutrition, food acceptability, right? Where is the food coming from? And what was interesting in Ohio was all of a sudden in some counties, the sheriff's office has actually stepped up and started delivering Meals on Wheels to try to fill this gap that they saw happening. Okay. So like I mentioned before, our ESF partners really didn't understand much about the food system. And we actually had to spend a lot of time explaining that the food system is actually pretty global, and we didn't know how that was going to be affected in a pandemic, and that it's also very local, right? And that we have these systems that are operating simultaneously, then the different way that affects what we see on the ground, and that there's also seasonality components to when the food system is going to be affected and where it's going to be affected. So there was a big learning curve for our partners. I have to give a lot of credit to our partners because they were really sharp at ESF, and they said they very quickly realized just how big of an issue this was. And that's why I think that they continue to be on a journey with us on this. Because we also had to explain to them, like the rest of the country, right? Why are farmers dumping milk even as people go hungry, right? So they were also having to confront this and explain this to other state agencies and other constituencies. Why don't we have food? What's happening here? How do we get food to people? There's also a lot of shifting policy that was happening at this moment. These are just a couple headlines that I had pulled. There were things that were happening with school meals. USDA was going to end coronavirus exception, making SNAP recipients prove their income to get food stamps, right? But we knew that food stamps were actually one of the most efficient ways to get food into the hands of folks and to have them be able to purchase the food that they prefer, right? And to get people actually supporting local grocery stores. And the food box program really complicated those things in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of shifting policy that's happening at the federal level that trickles down to the state and to the local that had to be navigated through. At the same time, ESF 6 is also navigating housing, right? So when we're thinking about community stability, we know housing, we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We know food and housing are really critical issues. And so there's a lot of questions that they were having to deal with about putting folks in hotels for quarantine, but then also how do you get food to them? All of these different types of also kind of disorganization that can occur within a community. And we're still seeing that today, right? Because of all the job losses and the cascading effects of could people pay their rent or not, and what eviction does in terms of the ability to maintain and hold your job, access to all kinds of different services. We're seeing how we know that food and transportation and housing are really key for individual welfare and community welfare. So this is something that else that ESF all of a sudden was being hit with at the same time. And because, again, we're focusing on food, there's also a lot of changes that are happening, right, within the food system in terms of, right, essential workers at the grocery store. How can they be protected? People weren't wearing masks when they're going into the grocery stores, especially local politics in Ohio. People were also, right, shifting onto online deliveries, which also meant big changes in the supply side of the food system that needed to be navigated. And then one of the things that we also really helped ESF 6 and ESF 11 really understand was also, right, where are the vulnerability in the people that are producing the food, right? What's happening with farm workers as we started to see some of the early cases in New York State in the greenhouses, especially among migrant worker populations. That was something that we were able to alert our partners at emergency management. Like, this is something, we know that there's a migrant community in Ohio, right, that's producing the food. Like, we need to get on this. We also have an aging farm population that's also more vulnerable to COVID, but they're also in rural communities that are less likely to be wearing masks and seeing the direct impacts of COVID right away. And so because we were able to share these insights, it provided some new opportunities for Ohio emergency management to try to figure out who should they be coordinating with and what state agencies could be brought in. And this is actually something that Mary sent me a really great article about the issue with restroom closures along highways and interstates and how this was affecting our truckers. And my brother-in-law is a trucker. And I think that this is, again, something that was really underappreciated is when truckers lost access to restrooms and also retailers like Walmart, where they could usually go to the restroom and clean up, that all got shut down during COVID. You have folks that become increasingly stressed, right? They can't relieve themselves, they can't rest, they can't clean up. And I don't know that there was real appreciation that these folks oftentimes are transporting highly perishable foods. They could be transporting livestock with zoonotic diseases potentially. And there's perishability issues. And so this also introduced some food safety risks that I'm not sure folks were completely aware of or thinking about from the Department of Transportation's perspective. And something we were able to do is to try to communicate that and help get to the governor's office to say, please make sure these rest stops get open because it's really important for the truckers. One of the other things that we also brought in as a perspective to ESF was thinking about some of the social disorganization and studying food systems. There's a lot of appreciation for how food is very cultural, right? So not only are you offering the right types of food, but also the way that food can sometimes also have negative impacts. So domestic violence, right, can actually unfortunately be triggered by food, right? You could think of a scenario, right, where the partner doesn't like how the steak is cooked, right? Or you didn't bring home the right kind of peanut butter. And all of a sudden that leads into a cascading argument where there's unfortunately violence involved. And we could see that, right, domestic violence rates started to increase in COVID. And this was something that we could actually anticipate happening. And so there's also this other part of how is food affecting community welfare, right, which is going to impact the ability to get back to work for kids and the stability that they have at home and being able to, again, become a productive member of your family and your community. So then at the same time, we also started to see in the media a lot of conversations about, this renaissance of local foods and how a lot of small and medium farms were really able to pivot, especially as they lost their restaurant accounts into direct marketing. And there's a lot of really great stories around this and how important having these small and medium sized farms are. And when we didn't have enough processors, what kind of a bottleneck that created. And our ESF partners were like, oh yeah, no, we're starting to understand actually how important how having these folks are, because in Ohio, we actually had a lot of small and medium processors in the state. And so we weren't like some other locations that really got hammered really hard with this. But at the same time, some of the work I do is on how health insurance and childcare really affect economic development and quality of life for farmers and ranchers. And what we saw is that COVID-19 actually created a much more complex reality for farmers, especially those who have young children, right? And we're trying to make calculations of, do they hire workers? who might have COVID, which partners should be in the field and be at increased risk of exposure for COVID or doing direct marketing. Online sales not always working out as well as we might hope that they would. Also trying to take care of kids and homeschool kids while you're trying to meet your customers' expectations. And so there's been actually some focus groups going around the country, or parent support groups that have emerged, because this has actually created a lot of stress for certain types of farmers. And I guess the other thing is just really important to remember, right, is that any of the impacts and then responses and lived experiences, as we know, is always going to be impacted by the region that you live in, whether you're in an urban or rural community or suburban community, the place you are in your life course, your age, your race, your gender, your ethnicity. These things are all going to shape different experiences and different responses to COVID and how we manage them. I think one of the things also that was really interesting in all this, and that we really shared with ESF 6 and 11, is something that again, I have to credit Mary with this, is really bringing our attention to some of the work that had been done actually back in 2015, looking at how resilient is the US food system to pandemics. And one of the things that these models predicted is that actually we're not resilient. And one of the reasons is because of worker absenteeism. Right. So I think for those of us who work in community development, it's not really a surprise to us that people are the most important part of the system. Right. And it's the biggest part that we tend to overlook when we're trying to build resilience and thinking about these food systems and some of the approaches that are actually being implemented today. So I think we're really also trying to steep in and bring in that rural sociology, food systems, ag economics, also public administration into disaster management as we're creating this new marriage really between us, and how do we take these things and actually start to prepare for the next disaster and disruption. And our journey here is really long-term, right? We kind of know we're still in the middle of COVID. We're not disillusioning ourselves, but our partners with emergency management are like, we know that with climate change, with all kinds of other issues that are coming down the pike, we need to be prepared. So what we're doing now is really trying to also think about what is resiliency in a vulnerable food system, right? What does that look like? And when we look at the literature, a lot of it really frames it as absorbing and recovering from shocks. And it tends to be right about ecological resistance, that biological ability to kind of bounce back, right, to recover from a disturbance. And then there's also the social resilience literature. And that's really been looking at resilience in terms of it from an individual level, and then also from a community level. Right. And I think one of the things that we also do know about this literature that we also kind of overlay as rural sociologists is it hasn't really dealt very well with power dynamics and power issues. Right. And I just kind of want to put that out there, as I don't have a good answer for it, but I know that this is something that Mary and Bill and I talk about as we're thinking about how do we build more resilient food systems and what is the structure of the food system that we actually have to address. So I wanted to quickly go over some of the actual work that we're doing here in Ohio and some of the methods that we're using for trying to weave food into emergency management. We have a small grant that is actually allowing us staff time to actually try to gain a baseline inventory of how state agencies, private sector, and civil society intersect with food systems to respond to disasters. Because I think what this really laid bare was that we do not have a state food policy council in Ohio anymore. There was no mechanism for bringing people together, for having interagency conversations. Emergency management had no idea. So we actually needed to create some kind of baseline and actually create some kind of visualizations to actually help map, right, these different groups. And then really try to also create some plans for what we're going to do in the future. And when we first started out, you see this graphic on the right? This is kind of a very simplified graphic of different state agencies and different ways in which they intersect with Ohio families, right? And we kind of really had basis around the idea of having food security. So what we're trying to do is both a process of engagement, because we realize, especially without a food policy council, right, we actually are both doing research, but we're also trying to create networks across different state agencies through the research process. So it's a really great example, right, of integrated research and extension. So for the first phase, right, it's assembling databases, going through kind of what's publicly available on websites. And then we're just about finishing up conducting interviews with all the different state agencies, especially those that have direct connections with our emergency management partners. And now we're mapping, which I'm going to share with you in a little bit. And then the next phase is actually for us to facilitate conversations across these different agencies and create different scenarios and case studies that could be used for training for different types of disasters and disruptions, and what might happen and how agencies could better work together. So the first thing we've done is really to create these databases, and this is just a draft, but we looked at all the different programs, right, of how they're flowing from the national level to which different state agencies, and then who is actually in charge of them, and then kind of also local actors that we could identify through this process. And the goal here is really to create a searchable database that way, if there's a particular issue that emerges, that emergency management could have an easier time figuring out what are the programs and policies and agencies that are associated with specific issues. So I wanted to now just show you some of the visualizations that we've been doing of this mapping process that have been resulting from both the database collection and also the interviews. And what's interesting is if you look on the right hand, you'll see that there's a legend. And so we've been able to try to map where there's political influence, right? So who's got that political influence, funding, who's got the authority in program administration, other administrative capacities, different types of education and advising, and then really try to map out who is in the public sector, who are the nonprofits, and then who's the private sector actors in this. And really do this at the national, state, and we're just really beginning to do this at the local level. And you can see, you know, it's a little busy. And then as we start to zoom out, it gets really busy. Right. And all of a sudden, if we're just looking only at food security policies and programs. So again, this is only food security. We start to see all the different departments, the different agencies, right? And then at the bottom, who's the end user? Who are they directed to? How are funds flowing? How is regulatory authority flowing? Right. And then we can, when we actually increase this, right, this is actually the one with funding. And as you can see, right, with each layer we add and more information, it gets harder to read and your eyes are squinting and you're like, Shoshanah, I have no idea what this is saying, right? But that's kind of the point, right, is to actually demonstrate how complex it is to navigate through these. This is kind of the penultimate, where we have in the green that's ESF 6 and the yellow is the yellow is ESF 6 mass care and the green is ESF 6. And what was really interesting is when we shared this map with our partners at emergency management, their reaction was, oh, this is really complicated. And oh, we're actually not overlapping as much as we thought we were. Right. So all of a sudden they could start identifying gaps, right? And where and how things were starting to flow. So again, this is just a little bit more of a close up. So I also, you know, just wanted to share a little bit what our next steps are, which is, as we finalize this map, is actually to convene the state agencies and start to engage in a process of facilitation that's really rooted in community, the best practices of community development, and say, are these maps accurate, right? Do they reflect what you told us? And we know they're not going to be accurate because they want us to, we want them to tell us what's missing so that they also feel engaged in part of this process, right? And what they see as some of the opportunities. People really talked about feeling like they were in silos. And one of the folks in emergency management really said that this is like the fog of war. We have no idea what anybody else is doing. And we really need actually like a food policy working group or a food working group from emergency management. And so we're trying to give them the tools to really facilitate this so that then again, we can provide support from the university in terms of helping to develop the case studies and training scenarios based on what we know as a food system, from the food system. The other thing that we really also want to do is we realize a small thing we could do that would actually be really big is to provide some professional development to the different agencies about what is a food system, right? And the different scales it operates at. And so people just actually start to understand it a little bit better. And then also, again, just to think about how do we kind of work more at the local level? is really some of the next steps that we want to also be figuring out. And I guess one of the things that also I'm talking to Mary and Bill about is as we move forward, we're kind of coming at this, whoops, that's my stop. But this is my last slide, is really thinking about this from two different lenses. One is the community food security side, and the other is the local regional food system side, right? And how do we also integrate some of these bottom up, but also top down approaches, right, for food systems coordination and planning as we're trying to get to these cross agency working groups. So we're trying to kind of take all of this and put this together and figure it out as we move forward. And with that, I just want to say thank you, and I'm excited for our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I have a question while the questions start to stream in through the chat, or as people sort of prepare themselves to ask their question. In any of your research, were you able to find examples of places, whether they were local or regional or national across the globe, that responded better to the pandemic as it relates to food and the food system?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Bill. And I think, again, this is something that I think that the center in Missouri, I think with focusing on food insecurity this is, I think, some of the things, the insights that you all really bring, in that there's acute and chronic food insecurity, right? And when people already are at this chronic stage, right, and also probably with poor access to healthcare and don't have a good social safety net, when there's any kind of disaster or disruption, it's just going to be that much harder to recover, right? And to weather through, not even just recover, but to kind of like navigate and weather through. And so I think the places that we see that have better social safety nets, that have healthier populations, are, going to be doing better. And the same thing is true in terms of communities. I was previously at the University of Vermont, and when I hear about what some of my colleagues there are doing, right, it's very different than the approaches. Also, places that have really stronger networks. In Colorado, there was the Colorado Department of Agriculture, made an immediate connection with Colorado State University and said, we need to really start working on this. So from day one, they were focused on these issues and could have a much quicker response. Yep, Mary, yeah, you can comment on that, please.
I would also point out that I was living in Iceland during the first 6 months, or the first part of the pandemic, and we didn't have any issues at the store. Like, there was hard, and this is an island that doesn't do a ton of their own food production. I mean, they do a lot of fruit and vegetable production and meat production, but not some other things. And it did not have the same kinds of storage or the same kind of shortages. And they have an extremely strong emergency management system, partially because they live on volcanoes, right? So they get earthquakes and eruptions, and they have to be really prepared for that. So that led into their preparation for something like the pandemic, because an eruption and a earthquake, I mean, while it's a sharp shock, right now they've had earthquakes for like 3 weeks now, thinking that there's going to be an eruption. So they're used to longer term emergencies as well. And I think that really shows it's small, it's easier to coordinate as well. So there are some good things about being small in that sense.
Shoshanah, I have a question. What can you explain a little bit more on the ecological resilience? I don't think I got that, what exactly you meant by that in that framework.
Sure. Thanks, Maria. I think it's that the majority of resilience conversations I think it's really rooted in ecology, and this idea when that there's a disturbance, like till you can get back to some kind of equilibrium state, and that idea of resilience is trying to be applied to social systems as well, right? And we hear a lot about this idea of what is a resilient community going to be in the face of climate change, or some of these other kinds of things. So I think that's one of the ways that we can also think about it is in terms of like our farming systems, right? Like the production component of resilience and ecological resistance, and then we're trying to layer on top this social resilience. I know I kind of went through that really fast.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat. emergency food services are fractured between various public and private providers. Did you find that they worked together better to address the pandemic, or that they went off on their own? And then there's another question about SNAP, but I'll let you answer that first one first.
Yeah, Michelle, that's such a great question. And that's actually something we're really trying to figure out a little bit and untangle. And, you know, there's, I think some of the issues, like also with food banks, kind of, they're kind of almost industries into themselves in some cases. And so we're trying to unpack that. I think that there's a good relationship there, but I think one of the other issues was, again, just this loss of labor, right? That some of the providers faced because of their age vulnerabilities. I don't know about USDA hearing the critique about the food boxes. I know that there's some stuff that just came out of the Wallace Center about the food boxes. I'm a little concerned that we may be seeing a continuation, but I'm not sure. There's somebody who actually could speak more to that. I would love to hear anybody else's insights on that.
I'm aware that the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition did an evaluation of the food box program and offered recommendations for moving forward. So that information is out there and available.
Yeah. I think it's just, again, like, I think if we go back into like what we know already, which is like some of the most efficient ways to get food, I don't think that was the best way. And when we think about it again, from a recovery standpoint of getting, you know, folks back to work in the grocery stores and having supply chains, I mean, like retailers know how to do it, right? Like they do it every day, and they have really well-established relationships and partners, and there's the flexibility in the hours, and people can go in. And I think that it's, you know, I appreciate what Food Box is trying to do, but I'm not sure it accomplished its goals. Yeah, SNAP is better for rural grocery and for getting those dollars circulating in an economy again.
So I'm interested, Shosh, about the kind of the emergency. You've been really focused on coordinating with the state level emergency management. So do you have you talked to the people at the community level that are doing that emergency work at the community level? Or is that something you're still working on? And then, you know, are you getting different responses from them versus what's happening at the state? Do they see it differently or the same?
Yeah, so that's such a great question, Mary. And I think that was one of the learning experiences of being on that task force. I'm curious to hear more about your experiences in Missouri. Is that I really had thought that because extension is part of, you know, Eden, and because it's part of this, like, oftentimes emergency management, that we would have had much stronger coordination and response and conversations, and that really didn't happen from the county extension office perspective. Starting to try to talk to some health departments, right, and hear some of their things. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head, where that's really where we need to go next, to also hear their perspective and how did this vary across geography and urban and rural and different places and social cohesion and things like that.
I'd be really interested. We have a lot of community development extension folks on. If you can you offer any comments on that, or what you saw at the community level here in Missouri?
Mary, this is Connie Burnham, and I have two dogs, obviously, that are running around downstairs where they shouldn't be. So you'll have to ignore them, hopefully. I'm the emergency management coordinator for our extension here. And so I have a lot of contacts on the state level, and the way Missouri is organized as far as the State Emergency Management Agency is that they have a very, very strong emergency human service sector. And as part of that, there's two committees. One of them called the Missouri VOAD, which is Missouri Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. We're a member of that, extension is. And then, and I'm the liaison to that. And then we also have another group, and it's more of a policy group, came out of the 93 floods. It's called the Partnership, with many other words to it, but we'll just say the Partnership. And these again are, volunteer organizations and state agencies that work together. So and so, the food bank is, on the state level is part of that. And so when the pandemic, which, when I look at how quickly that happened, it's like if Missouri had their earthquake, because all of a sudden it just affected everybody in the same way. It just was so all of a sudden there. But that group, those two organizations have, worked really, really diligently on this food, issue. Now, on the local level, these partners then are working on the local level as well. So anyway, so it's just different, than what, I'm hearing, from Ohio, because the state already had a system in place, because this group, and I don't, so I guess my question to Ohio is, do you have a voluntary organization active in disaster? Do you have that kind of an organization on a state level, which I assume that they do? And that should be a partner in this discussion as well, because they're the ones who are, are providing the mass care on the local level.
Yep, absolutely, Connie. And I think, you're really raising some very important points. And I mean, one thing we didn't even talk about was also how the National Guard became involved in so many states, and whether it was through food distribution or in Colorado, they were going into the meat packing plants. And I'm not sure if they were there to actually force people to work or if they were working themselves in the meat packing. I haven't quite gotten that.
I was going to say, that's interesting.
But yeah. And so I think, it is this really interesting coordination. And then even within that, what happens when you have volunteers that also need to go back to work, right? And because this is also, again, not a 3-day or a week-long event, this was a year, right? And so this sustained, and even we in Ohio lost one of our primary contacts because he's with the National Guard and he got activated. So he actually had to leave his emergency management post and go and work in the prisons because there wasn't enough time, and he's fortunately back. And so it's this issue. Then also, I think the other thing that we're also confronted with is also, how do we onboard folks within the state agencies about this? Because there's also a lot of turnover, right? And so when we're trying to even develop who is the right person to contact in the state agency who's coordinating this issue around a particular food program or policy, right? That can change very quickly. And so we're also trying to figure out, how do we help provide information for whoever's the next person to occupy that we can quickly onboard them with what they need to know.
And, Connie, you point out something that I think is really potentially different about Missouri in their organization on this, is partially because of the 93 floods, which were that was a 3, 4, 5 month event at the critical side. And then it went on and on, but just that those floods actually probably, and then we've had ongoing flooding problems in Missouri with the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. And that may have impacted the way our emergency management system works here in a different way, and maybe prepped us better for a chronic disaster. I mean, I think that that's something to, that we can think about. And the reason I say chronic is, I don't know how many of you have watched the, it's called Cooked, I think. It's a PBS special about the heat wave that killed so many people in Chicago in the 80s, was it? Or the mid 90s? Yeah. And how it really wasn't the heat per se, it was the social conditions. The people who were most affected, it was because they were the same thing as with COVID, because of their housing situation, their poverty, these kinds of things. So it was really like a chronic issue that then the heat exacerbated it and made it into a critical emergency. And so I think kind of that's what we're thinking, that's kind of what Shosh and I have been thinking about with the food system work and thinking about it, because it's like these we know, Bill knows better than me, but all of the work we've done at the center on hunger issues, it hasn't really been getting that much better. And then you throw COVID in on top of that, right? So that just exacerbates everything that's already been happening. And I think that that's kind of the key issue for us all to, think about and figure out how we, what can we do, right? And on that. So is there another, Connie, at the local level? Do you mean our co-ads? Because in my area, the co-ad did not really play a significant role during COVID. We meet and share info, but they have an active role as they did with tornadoes, for example. So Connie, can you explain what co-ad means? And this is useful sharing for Shoshanah as well, I think.
I was going to say on the local level, we call them the same thing as on the state level, where we call it a voluntary organizations active in disaster. On the local level here in Missouri, we call them community organizations active in disaster. And not every county has one. And so they may have gotten involved in some of this, but more than likely not. I sit on a weekly call with co-eds right now, and they're, they just continue to meet. It started right after the pandemic started, and they meet every week, the organizations, and including anybody in the local, co-ed that joins, so that we can hear what's actually going on. Are there issues out there? And so when there's information coming through about housing funds that are coming through, that will help not only the person that's behind in their rent, but also the landlords and, all of the the CARES Act funding and things like that. That is shared on just weekly, so that anybody, and so we can kind of keep track of what's going on the local level, on the state level, so we can see how that, and is there, things that somebody is doing that somebody else, another county might say that's good. But again, Maria is in a county that has, I think, a pretty strong co-ed. And it came because of the Joplin tornado in 12, wasn't it? 2012?
Yes, 2011. So they do all the, they're signing up people for SNAPs, they're providing housing, all of that. They're actually overwhelmed right now with everything. But what I don't see is coordination as they have had before in terms of educating people about issues on COVID or vaccinations information. They actually are not on board on those things. So they are reacting to certain things, but they're not really participating with the health departments more actively. In fact, the health departments have not been participating in these meetings, and I attend all of those meetings here.
Yeah. So, well, on the public health side, there's medical reserve corps, and that came about as the funding for bioterrorism came in early 20, I don't know,
2000, 2001.
Yeah, there you go. I couldn't get that word
2002.
out there, that number. So when that came through, and I was working for the state health department at that time, and so I was working under that grant, and that brought in a lot of requirements. And one of the things that the feds wanted is that every state would have a state medical reserve corps, which we do, and it's called Show Me Response. And the other is that every county public health department would have one. So in the event such as this, there would be volunteers that would be ready to come in and help. And so, so I think that, co-eds, although I think that certainly the Public Health and Medical Reserve Corps could actually come in as a partner to a co-ed. I just don't know that they are.
I think, Connie, so that's so interesting because I was at the rural medical conferences and went to a couple presentations on disaster medicine. Right. And I think that's actually like one of the really interesting things is like that there's like a whole network of doctors and medical professionals and nurses that really focus on disasters, and that there's some countries actually have written into their constitutions protocols for disasters and medicine. And so, but those folks are also not thinking about food. right? And they're like, oh,
Right,
food's really
right.
important. And they're not, but they're not
Right.
thinking about what does this mean in different
Right.
types of disaster scenarios, or they're only thinking about it in terms of food safety. If we don't want to get people sick if the food's not refrigerated.
Or they're looking at it through their WIC program.
Yeah.
Which, have they really, really thought outside of where it normally goes and how it normally gets handled. So.
But I agree that I think that that's actually like a really great opportunity, I think, for how can we build some of these new networks, and because oftentimes, public health gets food, right? And I think it's just a matter of maybe talking a little bit more about what we're talking about to create some new alliances.
Just another observation from Iceland, that when you had to go into quarantine in Iceland, then they were very strict about this, right? Because they had a very, very rigorous contact tracing. And so they would, they would have 700-800 people in quarantine at one time during the height of the pandemic. And so that's a significant amount of their population. That'd be like having 700-800 people in quarantine here in mid-Missouri, right? But when you were in quarantine, you could actually, they had people from the health, it's national health, so they would have people calling and contacting them. But you could get, if you didn't have somebody that you could rely on for groceries, there was somebody they would activate, and a lot of it's activated, I think, through the Red Cross chapters. They would activate those people to get you groceries, right? So, and a lot of Iceland is very rural. There's the capital city is not so much, but a lot of it is very rural and isolated, but they could get people out and doing that. And I think, again, it comes back to their long-term experience with, okay, because you can have a volcano go off anytime. They've evacuated a whole island before overnight when the volcano goes. So I think that probably does influence everybody's perception of being involved. And perhaps in the US, we haven't had those kinds of things. So we're not really on deck in that same way. Although, in Missouri, we might have had that experience because of the floods too. Those floods, the 93 floods were pretty game changing in a lot of the things that we did in Missouri. Wouldn't you say, Connie? And some of the others.
Yeah, I was going to say the 93 flood really pushed this, responsibility to try to get better organized. And I don't know how many years ago that the Missouri VOED formed and really became very, very active. So when we're looking in Missouri, when we're looking at food systems and things like that, those volunteer organizations, American Red Cross, Sal Army, all of those groups, are right there. They're usually there before the state even says, hey, should we have a call? Because the chair of the Missouri VOED is a volunteer organization. They're not governmental organizations. And so they're run and organized by volunteer organizations. The nonprofits out there of those state government agencies are invited, including us, because we're somewhat of a state agency. We get us, we're not a volunteer organization. We're not a nonprofit. So anyway, we're invited to the table because we've always been pretty active in the disaster world. So.
And then it goes back to what you were saying, though, Shosh, about the global networks. And I think that's some of our interests. So Shosh and I are very interested in developing some of these ideas further. So, anybody who is interested in that, I'd love for you to get in touch with us on some of these things. Bill, how are we doing on time? Do we have more questions? We've probably the time going.
We've got 2 minutes left, and I believe Jeff Samborski has a question.
Okay.
Hello, I was just curious as to, are there physical improvements, capital investments that we should be looking at in terms of refrigeration, other infrastructure types of investments, realizing those can't be put into place overnight? So maybe she has some experience on that.
I'm curious, Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Me? Yeah. I was going to say, in the economic development world right now, it's pretty well known that we're short of a lot of refrigerated space. So when we have economic development projects, a lot of those go away because we don't have space available. So that leads me to believe that if we needed a lot in our emergency preparedness realm, that that is lacking. So it's just not sitting out there. But there may be some other capital improvements beyond those that are needed. So I don't know if you've run across any of that or if that's part of your review.
Yeah, no, that's I think a great question. That's actually something Mary and I have talked about, that we really would like to spend some more time looking at how other countries think about national stockpiles, right? Like I know, like I think it was Sweden recently said that they're not going to keep coffee in their national stockpile anymore, right? But like, so like, what are the types of foods that you would also want on hand, right? That are going to be, dense and nutrient rich, and then where would you store them, and then what are the conditions? And then also in terms of like that distribution, right? Because I think this is also part of the other question around social infrastructure is who's included and who's excluded, right? When it comes time to getting out food. And we've been seeing that in COVID. But I think this also goes hand in hand, right, with where we're trying to think about with creating the resiliencies, the redundancy in regional and local food systems, right? That we have multiple meat packing plants, that we have that are small and medium scale, that we have lots of different maybe food hubs with different types of refrigeration and storage capacities, so that if one goes out, the whole system doesn't go out. I mean, that's where we saw our most vulnerability in the meat supply, was because that's the most concentrated, right? And the fewest number of meat processors that are delivering so far across the country. And so I think that that's actually the argument for also how do we also create jobs through this system, right? Like how do we create well-paying jobs that are going to create, that make us all more resilient in the long term, because that then also addresses some of these issues with chronic food insecurity. If you can pay for food, you're better off to begin with.
Wow, are we out of time, Bill?
We are out of time.
But that was excellent. Thank you so much, Shosh, for doing this, and everybody for coming on and sharing your thoughts. And our next speaker, actually, next in April was on here, Michelle, and she'll have quite a bit to share with us about the supply chains, because that's her bailiwick. That's what she does a lot of work on. So this is exciting, and I'm glad we recorded this, because I'm like, oh, Shosh, we need to go back through this for our work. So wonderful. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for having me and for sharing everything. I hope we can continue to have conversations in the future.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you, Shoshanah, and thanks everybody for
Thanks,
attending.
Shosh.